This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Podcast. Today's discussion is no good news plus 10 more stories that we're following this morning. So the first story today is the markets point down more than a percentage point, having an absolutely horrendous day, and probably as much as anything due to both the federal government being positioned for potential shutdown as the Democrats and Republicans can't agree to fund the budget to the higher limits. They're at the limit. Most likely thing is sooner they'll come to a deal that keeps it going, but gets us to another point like this in 4 to 8 weeks or so. But it's possible that they can't come to a deal. If I was to look at something with irony or look at things as though with a jaundiced view or a skeptic's view, there's so many different bad actors here. And I'm totally a believer that we have to get federal spending under control. So to an extent, I don't blame the Republicans for holding the line in this. But when I hear President Trump say that they should force a shutdown to get government spending under control, I do think that's highly ironic given how bad he was for deficit spending as well as President Biden has been for deficit spending. From my perspective, neither of them have been fiscal conservatives. Each have done a horrible job of minding the federal till. As we talk about regularly, debt kills families, countries, and companies. The excessive debt is horrible. But to have President Trump being a lead person for a federal shutdown to control debt after he was excessive in spending strikes me as very ironic. And excuse me for being political. I think both parties are absolutely awful. Second story today, Jamie Dimon, one of the great CEOs of our time, says something that we all know. He says the world and the economy aren't prepared for 7% interest rates. You combine nations, companies, families being overextended with too much debt and much higher interest rates, and it's a combustible situation. So we agree with Jamie Dimon. It seems obvious to me that this concept of 7% interest rates, I mean, you've got the situation where Fed Chairman Powell feels like he has to keep on raising interest rates to fight the inflation that comes from deficit spending. So you've got sort of a disaster, but Jamie Dimon is absolutely correct. The world's not really ready for 7% interest rates. We did just discuss great CEOs on a podcast. We'd love your thoughts on who you think is the greatest CEO. Different people we talked about: Jamie Dimon, Elon Musk, Judith Faulkner of Epic, Tim Cook of Apple, Satya Nadella of Microsoft. And also get a Johnny Spiso to that from the healthcare world, as well as Mike Dowling, Gene Woods, and many others. So many great leaders. Love your thoughts on who you think are the great CEOs of the current time. We got nominations for Jack Welch and some of the older CEOs. Why I agree or disagree, I don't know. We're talking about current CEOs, who are the great CEOs of our time. Third, Goldman Sachs reduces their GDP estimates based on expected higher interest rates for longer. Again, getting one step closer to recession in our country as those rates keep on going up. Fourth, in a fascinating story, I'll use sports as an analogy here. The Chicago Bears, which I'm a Chicagoan and a fan of, lifelong fan of, are probably one of the worst franchises in a very long time. They've now lost 13 games in a row, which is almost an incredible effort towards haplessness. And people have always blamed the owners of the Bears, and I've always said, well, they spend the money. But I think there must be something to this ownership criticism, whether in business or in sports. The owners both have to really want to win, and they have to do a good job of picking leadership. And what I see here is, even if the Bears spend the money, they seem to do a horrible job of picking talent and picking leadership. So maybe it is the fault of leadership and ownership more than anything else. Again, there seems to be a lot to be learned from this situation. Fifth story we're watching, Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's long-term partner, Berkshire Hathaway, said something brilliant about how you approach everything you do. He said, you approach places and double down on places where you're strong and others are weak, as opposed to the opposite, to compete in areas where you're weak and they're strong. I think there's so many lessons in this. It almost reminds me, better to be a big fish in a small pond than to try and win in a world where you're competing against everybody. You pick areas where you can compete well. When we started Becker's Healthcare, we would have got killed if we relied on print, not just because print changed, because there were so many other more dominant people that had more resources to double down in print than we could. So we doubled down on digital. And this goes back a long time ago, but it wasn't any sort of brilliance, is we couldn't win in that other area. When I look at making choices, if you're 5'7" like me, don't choose to try and become an NBA basketball player. Not that I have the talent or athleticism for it anyways, but you better compete in areas that you could compete better, not in areas you could compete worse. Like Charlie Munger hits this really well. I love this discussion on it. He says, don't play where you are stupid and others are smart. Pick areas where you are smart and others aren't so smart. Sixth, we hugely downloaded podcasts this weekend. And this is a concept of every team or business needs an enforcer, whether in sports or business. Someone ultimately has to be the chief operating officer, the police officer, to make sure that the trains run on time, that things get done, that people do what they're supposed to do, in whatever aspect of life. This came out of a discussion with two leaders working through something, but the idea that every team needs a leader, every team needs an enforcer, someone who's going to be the police officer, true in sports, true in business, true in almost all aspects of life. Seventh, thrilled to have the chance today to record a Lean Toss podcast with two great leaders from WakeMed Health and Hospitals. Those were Dr. Chuck Hart and John Peterson, about how they use the Lean Toss system to manage operating rooms, and how much they've improved operating room efficiency, data visibility, as well as on-time starts across our operating rooms. Just fascinating. Eighth, excited to kick off the Becker's Healthcare, Health IT, plus Digital Health meeting next week. I'm excited to interview Tim Tebow, also Jerry Rice there, and a ton of others. Ninth, one of the concepts we talk about regularly with separate podcasts on this is the quality of managing up versus managing down. And one of the worst qualities you could see in leaders is those that manage up versus managing down. One of the things I noticed, and it plays out in all aspects of life. I remember an administrator that the board all loved, and then we found out that that person was nasty to the staff, and that's why we had so much difficult retention problems with staff. We see it with clergy, where they always call on the richest people in the room to be up front in church or synagogue versus regular people. And I'm sure it's the same in mosques as well, or every place where you've got leaders that sort of really take care of the rich donors, but nobody else. This concept of managing up versus managing down, I find to be one of the most despicable types of actions in business. And it goes back to the old saying, treat everybody the same. Obviously you have to take care of your best customers, but you have to do so in a way that's polite and professional and not so weighted towards, showing yourself in such a non-caring way for others as well. So I find that bad behavior, and particularly in organizations. You treat everybody well, everybody nicely. Doesn't mean you don't demand performance from people, but you don't go out of your way to sort of take care of the rich and shoot the poor. Last story today, 44 million Americans about to start paying back student debt. It's amazing what student debt and the cost of higher education and what a debacle this has all become. Now, I'm not a big believer in the debt relief, getting rid of debt. Many people paid for their school, and so it's not fair to them if you let others off the hook in their. But it will have an impact on the economy as this hiatus of paying back debt starts to end. People start paying back their debt. Literally 44 million people that have student debt. Simply an amazing number. In any event, thank you for listening to the Becker Private Equity Podcast. We'll be back with you with some separate issues on things we've talked about: ownership, managing up, and a lot more. Thank you for listening to the Becker Private Equity Business Podcast.